this paper came about because back in April I did a examination of the roots of steampunk on my blog on Free the Princess, and it was just a quick examination of a few root genres that I'd looked at some contemporary novels and realized that they drew influences from all of these other places. And really, the reason I went with 19th and early 20th century is because you see in steampunk the literature of the Romantic period, the Romantic, Victorian, and Edwardian periods of British history, which actually end up falling into 1800 to roughly 1930. This is going to end up going a bit back from that, just because of the way that the literature actually runs. Now that's where you get the 19th and early 20th century. So we went for that. These 6 root genres that I'm going to be talking about today are Gothic romance, urban Gothic, scientific romance, the alternate history, the detective story, and the dystopian novel. Now, those 6 genres, I'm going to end up comparing them to 5 novels that are considered steampunk that have all been published within the last 10 years. Actually, within the last 5, technically. So we're starting off with Gothic romance because it's also it's the earliest genre of the 6. It really starts off in 1765 with the publication of Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. And that's the earliest novel that you can talk about that is actually a Gothic romance. And the whole reason for this genre is because during the Enlightenment period, there was a neoclassicist viewpoint, which talks about logic and science, and basically the paranormal does not exist, is what the neoclassicists believed. Gothic romance came about in the latter part of the 18th century as a rejection of that. They're focusing on emotion, not on logic. Horace Walpole, in the introduction to Castle of Otranto, actually talks about focusing on fancy. And fancy doesn't mean like fantastic things like ghosts and demons, but rather on imagination. The imagination of creating these fictional worlds. Now, an interesting thing is that there's a lot of Gothic stories that are kind of silly. You have one of the authors that I have is this Robert Hume, writes in one of his papers, it is usually assumed that all Gothic novels are much the same, and that the form is defined by the presence of some stock devices. These Gothic trappings include haunted castles, supernatural occurrences, sometimes with natural explanations. Think Scooby-Doo, almost. Like those types of mystery stories where the ghost is actually Old Man Peters in a mask looking to make some quick bucks. Now, and you go over with secret panels and stairways, ancient manuscripts that you find in these secluded halls out in the middle of the wilderness. Now those end up being slightly silly because if you use those stock devices, people will call it Gothic even though it's not an accurate representation of it. Now, basically, this assumes then that everything that has that sort of trapping is a Gothic story. The Hound of the Baskervilles, which is a classic example of a detective story, has pretty much all of those characteristics. You've got your ancient legend, your supernatural occurrence, your crazy Baskerville Hall out in the middle of the wilderness. But it's not a Gothic story. It's a detective story. because it deals with logic. Now, the two primary best examples of the Gothic sensibility are actually separated, as you see here, by a generation. And the reason for this is Frankenstein was European, and Moby Dick was written in the US. So there was a time period for a little bit where literary traditions lagged a generation. Like if they started in England and then moved to America, it would always be a generation later. And for steampunk, you have a lot of this sort of horror that Gothic stories are focused on. They have a villain hero, you know, like, Captain Nemo. The presentation after mine will talk about Captain Nemo. He is a Gothic hero because he doesn't really have, like, you're not really sure whether he's good or evil. He has a good side, he has a bad side. And it doesn't really come down on whether he's actually a villain or not. He's heroic, but he does very bad things in pursuit of that heroism. And that's one of the primary things of Gothic, is there is no clear answer. It's all shades of gray. Frankenstein does this actually very well, because Victor Frankenstein himself is your classic man who is capable of great things. And if you read Mary Shelley's book, she spends a whole lot of time talking about how Victor Frankenstein can do a lot of very good things with his intelligence. He's extremely smart, extremely charismatic, but very, very tortured. That's the hallmark of the Byronic hero. And so as an example, this is one of those cases where you'll see these URLs a lot. I'll show you the video in a second. This is also for people who are watching this later so they can go to that URL themselves. This is from the Kenneth Branagh version of the movie. So you see here that a lot of the steampunk mechanics and the winches and all of these scientific mad scientist sort of things going on. Alright. And that'll do. So let's see. And then the other important thing of the Gothic sense is there's a character of an innocent in every Gothic story. In Frankenstein, it's Elizabeth. In Moby Dick, it ends up being Starbuck. You go to the modern novels, and Bone Shaker by Sherry Priest has this. It has Dr. Minericht, you could kind of say, is a little bit of a Gothic hero, because he does do good things for the people of Seattle, of the ruined portion of Seattle, but he also works under his own very kind of odd agenda. And then Zeke is the innocent of that story. Now, before I move on to Urban Gothic, does anyone have any questions? Comments? Observations? Thinks I'm crazy? All right. Now, the next part is Urban Gothic. That's the subset, of course, of the original Gothic story, because you have, one of the interesting things that you have with Urban Gothic is a lot of the men and women who are writing these types of stories grew up reading Mary Shelley, reading Herman Melville, reading all of the classic Gothic stories. And in roughly the 1850s, when Urban Gothic started coming about, you started seeing Britain becoming less of an agrarian society and more living in the cities. You know, have urban poverty. You basically have the sense of two Londons. There's the London of the poor that you see in the Whitechapel district and the Jack the Ripper murders of the latter part of the 19th century. And Sigmund Freud's theories on the mind ended up coming around in this same period. So those two things, there's the terror that you can have in the dark portions of the city and the very rundown sections, thieves, murders, all of these things, infuses urban Gothic and basically takes the Gothic sensibilities that used to be in a castle out in the wilderness or a deserted abbey and sticking it smack in the middle of London or Paris or New York or any sort of major city. It's basically saying, like, this can happen here. Physical distance from the reader, one of the hallmarks of the earlier Gothic, kind of went away with urban Gothic because it was taking place in the city where you were living. Now, Charles Dickens actually was the one who created the concept of urban fog in his story Bleak House, which ends up giving a very good sense of where urban Gothic was going. And you have these major work, you have Dracula and the Picture of Dorian Gray and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You read these stories and this is the urban Gothic. This is what these authors flavored the sense of taking the Gothic terror of Walpole, of Shelley, of Melville, and moving it deeper, moving it into the city. Dracula himself goes from the wilds of Transylvania, which would have been a traditional Gothic story, and going into Carfax Abbey, right in the middle of London. There's the terror. That's where Bram Stoker took the terror to. He took it to people's back door. And with steampunk, a lot of the steampunk stories happen in the city because they're very industrial. You have the terrors of the Industrial Revolution, of losing a limb in the factories. These people in the shadows that you might not see, but still make the world run. And two very good examples are actually Whitechapel Gods by S.M. Peters, where it takes the entire district of Whitechapel and turns it into this massive steam-driven hell. In other words, it's an urban Gothic story in that it takes place solely in the context of the city. Ekaterina Setia's The Alchemy of Stone, it doesn't happen on our world, it happens on a fantasy world, but at the same time you have that urban Gothicism threading through that story. It helps also that Setia based her novel around the Russian Revolution of 1905, so it has that sort of Gothic terror moving into things. Let's see. Now, so there, you see my web link again.